Hi and welcome to my new channel, Green Socks Literary. I decided I'd done gardening and I'd done eyesight improvement, and what I really want to focus on now is books and writing. So I hope this will be of interest to some people. I'm planning to do 2 videos a week, one of them about my own writing and the other one reviewing other people's books that I found interesting. So today I'm going to start by inflicting some of my own writing on you, because it's just to introduce me and the sort of thing I like to do, and I hope some people will find it interesting. But in any event, even if you only find it boring, perhaps you could just comment and let me know whether I should do something a little bit different. Anyway, here we go. This is my piece of writing about learning to read. In my Facebook account, I describe myself as a Bookinist. I came across the word one day on the internet and was tickled by it. It is an old-fashioned French word for an antiquarian bookseller. The culmination of my lifetime of interest in books is that I sell them to people. Mostly archaeology, but also some antiquarian. The importance of books was inculcated in me at a young age by my mother, which was odd because she didn't read much herself. There were not as many books in the world in those days as there are now, and the books that there were not always very interesting. My sister Pat learnt to read long before I did. Of course she would have done, being 3 years older than me, but even so, she was an eager beaver who seemed to romp through all the learning tasks that stopped me in my tracks. Mummy said that by the end of her first year at school, Pat had read every book in the classroom. And why couldn't I be like that? Mummy said this as a way of encouraging me to follow Pat's example, but I have to say that I didn't find it so terribly encouraging. She would sit me down and make me labour through a series of dreary primers, all about the stick family. Apparently these were sent home from school with me by my teacher, who wanted Mummy to help me with learning to read. The illustrations in the stick family books were not proper pictures. They were just boring monochrome drawings. The focus was on the words, not the illustrations. It was very hard work, and it gave me a nasty feeling inside. I wondered how it was that Pat had managed to pick up the art of reading so easily. Eventually, after much effort, I worked my way through the reading books. I was so pleased with myself. It was a big achievement. I wanted to read more. I knew there were many more interesting stories than the ones about the stick family, because Daddy would bring home picture books from the library to read to us at bedtime. He was a great user of libraries. So when Daddy brought home another library book, I became very excited and wanted to read it all by myself. So Daddy gave me the book, and I opened it, and to my deep disappointment, I found that I couldn't read any of it after all. It was a book about Baba the little elephant. For some reason, all the Baba books were printed in cursive script, joined up writing, which Daddy apparently could read, but I could not. It was as though people were deliberately making things difficult for me. Another difficulty was that in our house there was never enough money to buy books. We had to rely on a small reserve of friends and relatives to donate them at Christmas. Mummy's parents were not book lovers, and Daddy's parents and siblings were German. We accumulated several copies of that classic collection of cruel cautionary tales, Struwwelpeter. And besides the library books, Daddy had a compendium of Grimm's fairy tales in German, which he sometimes used as bedtime stories, translating as he went. Mummy had a few books, but she didn't really show any interest, apart from forcing me to learn to read. I didn't understand why this was until many years later, when she was in her early 90s. She would sit for hours in her sheltered accommodation, reflecting on her childhood, and then she would pass on her broodings to me. She grew up in a household almost completely without books. There was one shelf of turgid volumes which had been donated to her own parents as school prizes. And there was her weekly comic magazine, which was bought for her. But her family didn't use public libraries. Her mother was worried about germs. She wouldn't allow library books in the house in case of infection. I thought this was idiosyncratic and irrational. But it was only when our coronavirus pandemic came on the scene that I realised the real reason. It was the Spanish flu. Nobody spoke of it until COVID. Then suddenly we learned all about it, this previous pandemic that came along just before my mother was born, killing people in droves. They knew about germs, they just didn't know the precise means whereby the germs were transmitted. No wonder my grandmother was suspicious of public libraries. There was one book my mother remembered with fondness. Her parents used to go to whist drives, dragging her along with them. While they played, she was expected to amuse herself. So she wandered around the hall and found a book called Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. It had real stories in it. Every time there was a whist drive, she carried that book off into a corner and immersed herself in it avidly. But it was lean pickings all the same. I felt my mother's pain when she recalled that one of her school reports had stated bluntly that Joan should make an effort to read more widely, as if she had the means to do it and was only refusing to read through obstinacy or laziness or something. And if she dared to use any unusual words at home, her mother would soon stifle her adventurousness by saying scornfully, "What's the matter? You swallowed a dictionary?" They lived in Sheffield at a time when it was difficult to raise yourself out of respectable poverty, which I think made them rather snobbish. The whole family spoke broad Yorkshire, yet Joan was sent to elocution class, where her Yorkshire accent was erased and replaced with some approximation of Southern-approved pronunciation. It was only in times of stress that I heard the Yorkshire coming through in her voice. My father, by contrast, grew up in a middle-class, cultured German household, playing the violin and reading poetry. When he arrived in England just before the start of World War II as a newly naturalised Brit, his circumstances dictated that he learned to speak fluent English pretty quickly. He definitely swallowed a dictionary, and nobody would mock him for that. In the bedroom I shared with my younger sister Fran was a chest of drawers which contained various paraphernalia from Mummy's past. 2 marionettes and a wax writing tablet that she had made as part of her crafts dissertation, 2 fans that smelled musty, and some dressing-up costumes. There were also some strange books. Something called Idylls of the King, which was utterly incomprehensible, and another called Uncle Remus, which didn't even seem to be in English, although now I realise it was only a sort of patois, and if only I had heard it spoken, I could probably have followed it well enough. I was often desperate for something interesting to read, but if it wasn't easy to get into, I really didn't have the stamina. We also had a set of volumes called The Children's Encyclopedia, which I would dip into occasionally, even though it had too many words and the pictures were sepia. It was so heavy it was mainly useful for pressing flowers. At some point we discovered jumble sales, where you could pick up all sorts of treasures for hardly any money. I obtained a fat children's annual full of interesting stories. The only sign it had previously belonged to another child was the additions to the artwork in ballpoint pen. One of the stories featured a monkey, and the monkey had been given a stream of poop. It was shocking, not so much for the poop, as for the idea that some child had so little respect for their own books. I once tried to write my own name and address in a book, and it went wrong and could never be erased. To my mind, it had spoilt the book in an embarrassing way that would haunt me forever. So I learnt to be careful after that. In the middle class at primary school, we did a thing called group reading. We moved our desks together in groups of 6 and took turns in reading aloud. The teacher would hover between the groups, supervising. Evidently, it was meant to help the slower readers, but I found it horribly frustrating to listen to the gypsy boy in my group stumbling and stuttering over the words. It quite spoilt the flow of the story. I didn't appreciate that I was meant to be helping him, And then it came to my turn to read, and I had lost my place. The teacher scolded me roundly for not paying attention. But I had been paying attention, just not to the group activity. I had become so absorbed in the story that I had turned the page. I was reading effortlessly at last. Strangely, I was not getting praise for it. But I had made the skill my own, and no amount of scolding could take that away. So there it is, my little story about learning to read. And I'll end there, and later in the week I'm going to post a book review. See you later. Bye.